Hey guys, tonight we're going far, far back. Not a few centuries, not even a few thousand years, but millions of years into the deep past, to a time when the world was unfamiliar, unshaped by cities or roads, and where every breath of air, every drop of water, and every scrap of food had to be earned in ways most of us could hardly imagine. We're talking about prehistoric humans, or rather their ancestors and early relatives, living on an earth that could be brutal and beautiful in equal measure, a time before writing, before farming, before anyone could count the passing years, a time when the very concept of tomorrow was less important than surviving the night. So before you settle in, maybe dim the lights, pour yourself something warm, and allow the hum of the present to fade away. Let your mind walk barefoot on ancient soil, feel the bite of cold winds across open plains, hear the distant rustle of unseen predators in the dark. Tonight, we'll wander slowly through the story of how early humans sustained life in a world that often seemed designed to end it. We'll move step by step, from the raw landscapes of early Earth, through the slow invention of tools, the hunt for food, the mastery of fire, and the patient spread of humanity across continents. This isn't a tale of heroes or battles, but of quiet endurance, a testament to the stubborn will to exist against all odds. So let's begin our long walk together, back to where it all started. The world that greeted the earliest humans and their distant ancestors was a place of raw, unshaped force, a planet still in the restless throes of geological and climatic change. Long before the first fields were plowed, before villages rose from stone and timber, before even the notion of settled life existed, Earth was a shifting mosaic of landscapes. Mountains thrust upward by the slow violence of tectonic plates, plains stretched endlessly under pale skies, dense forests tangled with vines and shadow, and deserts where the wind carved ridges in the sand that no human foot had yet crossed. The continents, though broadly familiar in shape, wore a different face. Coastlines extended further in the cooler glacial ages, then retreated again as the seas rose with the warming of the ice. The climate itself was never a constant companion, but an unpredictable force, capable of transforming entire ecosystems in a matter of centuries, a blink in geological time but a span long enough to determine the fate of entire species. Ice ages came and went, blanketing much of the northern continents in thick sheets of frozen weight, pushing life southward into narrower bands where water still flowed and plants still grew. Between these frozen epochs, warmer interglacial periods allowed forests to expand and grasslands to flourish, only for them to shrink again under the cold's advance. In this alternating rhythm of expansion and contraction, survival was not about dominating the environment but about moving with it, accepting its shifts as unchangeable truths. Volcanic eruptions punctuated this vast timeline, spilling blackened rock and choking skies with ash, sometimes for months at a time. In certain regions, entire herds of animals vanished in the wake of such events, their grazing lands turned to wasteland, their water sources poisoned. Earthquakes reshaped river valleys, redirecting the flow of life-giving streams or sealing off access entirely. Even the very air could shift from a humid thickness under the canopy of a prehistoric rainforest to the dry, stinging winds that swept across savanna plains. For early humans and their kin, each of these forces was not an abstract disaster, but a direct and immediate challenge to existence. The animal world was equally indifferent, filled with creatures adapted perfectly to their specific niches, many of them far more powerful or better armed than any early human. Vast herds of prehistoric herbivores roamed the open spaces, giant antelope, shaggy-coated mammoths, and lumbering mastodons, while predators stalked the edges of these gatherings. Saber-toothed cats crouched in tall grasses, their massive fangs ready to pierce deep into flesh. Packs of giant hyenas, larger and stronger than any alive today, moved with tireless persistence, able to chase prey over great distances. Even rivers and lakes, so essential to survival, harbored dangers in the form of crocodiles and other reptilian hunters. For early humans, the simple act of drinking water could carry a risk that demanded vigilance and caution. Yet this world was not purely hostile. It was also abundantly alive. The cycles of life, though harsh, were predictable enough to be learned over generations. Trees shed their fruit in certain seasons, fish returned to spawn in familiar waters, and herds followed ancient migratory paths that could be tracked by those who paid close enough attention. The challenge lay in remembering these patterns, in passing on the knowledge of them, and in finding ways to adapt when the patterns inevitably shifted. The landscape itself offered both threats and opportunities. In some places, the high ground of rocky escarpments allowed for a wider view, enabling early humans to spot predators or distant herds. In others, dense forests provided cover from sight but reduced visibility to only a few paces, making encounters with dangerous animals sudden and unavoidable. Open plains encouraged movement, but left little shelter from sun, wind, or rain. Seasonal rivers might run full and fast in one month, and vanish into dust the next, leaving behind parched ground that cracked in the heat. Survival was a matter of navigating this unpredictable variety, with an awareness that every decision, to move, to stay, to explore, to hide, carried consequences. The air in these ancient times would have felt different on the skin, cleaner perhaps, but sharper, less forgiving. Without the moderating influence of agriculture and urban life, the seasons imposed themselves more directly upon the body. In cold regions, frost would settle deep into the bones, numbing hands and feet within minutes. In hot ones, the sun could burn through skin in a matter of hours, and water loss came swiftly to the unwary. Nights could turn dangerously cold, even after a sweltering day, forcing the need for shelter or fire. In this world, there was no concept of safety as modern humans know it. Every step into a new terrain was a step into uncertainty, and the measure of a good decision could be as small as finding a sheltered hollow before the rain began, or locating a patch of edible plants before hunger grew too sharp. Over time, patterns of movement emerged, not yet the migrations that would define later eras, but instinctive drifts toward places where life seemed more abundant, where danger was a fraction less immediate. Geology and climate shaped more than just the land. They shaped the bodies and minds of the creatures that lived there. Early human ancestors evolved with strong limbs for walking long distances, hands capable of fine manipulation for gathering and breaking, and eyes attuned to both the immediate detail and the far horizon. Their senses were sharpened not for comfort but for alertness. Smell and hearing warned of predators before they were seen, while sight tracked the slightest shift in movement in the grass or the trees. And yet, for all its dangers, this ancient earth carried a kind of quiet rhythm, a pulse that those who lived entirely within its terms could sense. The rising and setting of the sun, the slow drift of constellations overhead, the turning of seasons, these were constants in a world where little else stayed the same. This awareness would form the foundation of survival, guiding where to search for food, when to seek shelter, and when to move on. It was within this raw, shifting environment that the earliest humans began their long experiment in survival, not yet as tool makers, not yet as masters of fire, but simply as one among many species, tested daily by a planet that offered no guarantees. They did not yet shape their world, but they were shaped by it, molded by wind, rain, heat and cold into forms and behaviors that would slowly, across countless generations, become the earliest glimmers of what we now recognize as human. And as the ages turned, as climates shifted and lands changed, so too did these early humans begin to find their place within the vast indifferent theater of life. As the landscapes shifted and the climate alternated between long freezes and warmer intervals, life itself adapted in subtle but decisive ways. Among the many species that navigated this shifting world were the earliest direct ancestors of modern humans, creatures who were not yet as we are, yet already distinct from the other primates that shared their environment. They emerged not suddenly, but gradually, their forms shaped by millions of years of evolutionary pressures that favored certain traits over others, often for reasons that could only be understood within the context of their time. The earliest known representatives of this lineage, the Australopithecines, walked the earth between about 4 and 2 million years ago. They were not human, but they were no longer wholly ape-like either. Standing upright, though often no taller than a modern child, they bore a curious mixture of adaptations, long arms and curved fingers, that hinted at a life still partially in the trees, yet pelvis and leg bones configured for walking on 2 feet across open ground. Their skulls were smaller than ours, with brain sizes closer to those of chimpanzees, yet subtle changes in shape suggested the beginnings of new capacities, perhaps for more complex tool use, for more coordinated movement, or for more varied diet. These Australopithecines were not alone. They shared their world with many other primate species, each filling its own niche within the vast web of life. Some were purely arboreal, rarely descending from the canopy except to cross small gaps in the forest. Others, like the robust Australopithecines, developed heavy jawbones and large molars for grinding tough plant matter, an adaptation to the seasonal scarcity of softer fruits. Still others, leaner and lighter in build, ranged more widely across open savanna, where the ability to travel quickly and efficiently over distance meant greater access to scattered food and water sources. Predators cast a long shadow over all of them. The African plains and forests were home to carnivores of remarkable size and power. Lions in these ages were larger than those known today, and they hunted in a landscape that also contained saber-toothed cats, each equipped with fangs capable of bringing down large prey with a single bite. Packs of giant hyenas, muscular and relentless, could follow a target for hours, wearing it down until escape was impossible. Even snakes could be a lethal threat, their venom or constricting strength capable of ending life in minutes. The balance between predator and prey was never static. It was a daily, ever-present reality that shaped behavior, movement, and the patterns of rest and alertness. The emergence of the genus Homo, beginning with species like Homo habilis around 2.4 million years ago, marked a quiet but profound turning point. These early members of our genus possessed slightly larger brains than their Australopithecine predecessors, and with this came new possibilities. Archaeological evidence suggests that Homo habilis made use of simple stone tools, chipping flakes from river cobbles to create sharp edges for cutting meat or processing plant material. This was not yet technology in the modern sense, but it was a beginning, a way of altering the natural world however modestly to better suit survival. Physically, these early humans were still small compared to later species. They retained long arms and relatively short legs, suggesting a body still adapted to a mixed environment of climbing and walking. Yet their hands showed a greater precision grip, their teeth a more generalized form suited to an omnivorous diet. They could take advantage of a wider range of foods than their more specialized neighbors, eating fruits, tubers, nuts, small animals, and scavenged meat from larger kills. This dietary flexibility was an enormous advantage in a world where abundance could vanish in a single season of drought. Socially, these early human ancestors likely lived in small, loosely organized groups. Cooperation was essential, for no single individual could guard against predators, find food, and care for young entirely alone. Within these groups, the sharing of resources, whether a cache of gathered nuts or the meat from a scavenged carcass, reinforced bonds that increased the chances of survival for all. Though their communication was far from the complexity of modern language, a combination of vocal calls, gestures, and expressions was enough to convey warnings, coordinate movement, and indicate sources of food or danger. They were not the only hominins alive at the time. Overlapping ranges brought them into indirect competition with other Homo species as well as with robust Australopithecines. This competition was rarely direct conflict, rather it was expressed in the quiet ways populations shift over time, with some groups thriving in certain conditions while others dwindled as resources changed. The Earth in these ages was not static, and the traits that served one generation well could be less useful to the next. Everywhere they moved, these early ancestors left faint traces, stone flakes, broken bones bearing cut marks, and the occasional preserved footprint hardened in ancient mud. These marks speak to a life lived in constant negotiation with the environment. Tools made where suitable stone was found, camps set near water but not too close to the dangerous cover where predators waited, movement timed to follow herds without drawing too much attention. To survive as a relatively small and not especially fast species among the megafauna of the Pliocene and early Pleistocene required a combination of alertness, adaptability, and opportunism. The Australopithecines and early Homo species lacked the claws, fangs, or raw strength of many animals around them, but they had something less tangible, the capacity to learn from experience and to share what was learned. This was perhaps their most valuable survival trait. for the knowledge once gained could be passed from one generation to the next, compounding over time. Even in these earliest chapters there were signs of the slow trajectory that would far in the future lead to the shaping of environments rather than merely enduring them. But for now the balance still tilted heavily toward the Earth itself, which set the terms for survival. The early humans and their ancestors could only adjust their movements, their habits, and their small clever adaptations to the vast and indifferent cycles of the planet. As millennia passed, the landscapes they roamed would change again. Forests retreating, grasslands expanding, water shifting its course, and they in turn would change with it, carrying forward the lessons of countless generations who had walked before them, each one a small link in the unbroken chain of survival stretching into the deep past. Across the vast sweep of deep time, nothing exerted more influence over the fate of early humans than the slow, patient turning of Earth's climate cycles. The planet's orbit, its tilt, and the subtle wobble of its axis worked together in a complex rhythm, a celestial choreography that determined how much sunlight reached the surface, where ice would advance or retreat, and how oceans, forests, and grasslands would respond. These great cycles, measured in tens or hundreds of thousands of years, were not abrupt events to the creatures who lived through them. They unfolded so gradually that no single generation could perceive their full extent, yet their consequences were inescapable, shaping where life could flourish and where it would fade. During the glacial periods, immense ice sheets spread from the poles toward the mid-latitudes, locking vast quantities of water in frozen mass. Sea levels dropped, revealing broad land bridges that connected continents now separated by water. At the same time, inland climates became colder, drier, and less forgiving. Vegetation changed slowly but decisively. Forests thinned into open woodlands, and in some regions, grasses replaced trees entirely. These shifts affected every species, for when the plants changed, the herbivores followed, and when the herbivores moved, the predators, including humans, moved as well. For early humans, cold did more than simply lower temperatures. It shortened growing seasons, reduced the abundance of edible plants, and made water sources unreliable. Rivers could freeze solid in winter, and lakes could shrink in the dry seasons when less snow melted in the highlands. Gathering plant food required more travel, more memory of where certain roots or hardy berries might still be found, and more cooperation to ensure no group exhausted a single area's supply. Meat became a more important resource, but hunting in such conditions carried higher risks, for the prey were also leaner, hungrier, and more dangerous to approach. In contrast, interglacial periods brought warmth, though not always ease. Ice retreated, releasing meltwater that swelled rivers and reshaped coastlines. Forests expanded into once barren areas, and grasslands filled with herds of grazing animals. Plant life grew more abundant, offering a wider range of food sources. But with this abundance came change in the distribution of animals. Prey moved into newly green lands, sometimes across great distances, forcing human groups to adapt their ranges and learn the routes into unfamiliar territories. Warmer climates could also bring heavier rains in some regions, making rivers flood unpredictably and turning low-lying areas into marshes, where disease-bearing insects thrived. The most successful human groups in these shifting conditions were those able to move in rhythm with the changing world. This meant more than simply walking toward greener pastures. It required a deep, almost instinctive understanding of the seasonal and long-term patterns of the land. It meant remembering the timing of animal migrations, the location of perennial springs, the sequence of flowering and fruiting among different plant species. In times of scarcity, it meant knowing which foods could sustain life in emergencies. Bitter roots, fibrous tubers, or small animals that could be caught with minimal effort. Migration patterns evolved slowly in response to these pressures. Groups would spend part of the year in one location, moving with the seasons to follow water and game. Some traveled long distances along river valleys or coastlines, while others rotated between a series of familiar inland sites, returning to the same places year after year when resources replenished. The young grew up learning these routes as surely as they learned the shapes of the trees or the taste of the air before rain. This mobility was both a necessity and a skill, for while the land could not be controlled, it could be read like a map, if one knew what to look for. The cycles of ice and warmth also determined encounters with other groups. In times of abundance, ranges could expand without much overlap, reducing competition, but during harsher periods, paths often converged at the few remaining waterholes, sheltered valleys or reliable hunting grounds. Here, cooperation or competition could tip the balance between survival and collapse. Archaeological evidence suggests that in some regions, sharing of resources between groups was possible, perhaps even common, while in others, the scarcity of food and water may have driven conflict. For early humans, these climate cycles were never mere background conditions, they were the stage upon which every decision, every movement, and every adaptation played out. The gradual shifts in temperature and rainfall patterns shaped not only the food they ate, but the tools they made, the shelters they built, and the social bonds they formed. In colder ages, hides and furs became vital for warmth, encouraging the development of scraping tools to prepare animal skins. In warmer, wetter times, lighter coverings and more open shelters sufficed, and plant-based foods regained prominence in the diet. Yet, despite the challenges, the cycles also offered opportunities. The drop in sea levels during glacial periods exposed new land routes between continents, enabling human ancestors to expand their range into territories that would later be cut off by rising seas. Coastal migrations became possible along broad, exposed shorelines, where tidal pools, shellfish and fish could be harvested with relatively low risk. Some of these migrations left enduring marks, with early humans settling new regions and adapting to their unique conditions, only to be cut off when the waters rose again in the warmth of the interglacial return. Survival in such an unpredictable system demanded adaptability above all else. Those who could not alter their behavior, who relied too heavily on a single food source or a fixed territory, often dwindled when the climate turned against them. Those who diversified their diets, adjusted their movements, and kept their social bonds strong had a far greater chance of enduring, passing their knowledge, skills, and resilience to the next generation. These relentless cycles, repeated over hundreds of thousands of years, shaped the evolutionary path of our species. Long before we began to leave lasting marks on the land, they selected for endurance, for mental flexibility, and for a capacity to read the subtle signs of change. And as the ice advanced and retreated again and again, the humans who lived through it learned not only how to endure it, but how to make use of the opportunities hidden within its harshness. This capacity to adapt, to respond without panic to the slow, inevitable shifts in the world, would serve them well as new challenges emerged, not only from the sky and the seasons, but from the ground beneath their feet, in the form of the places they chose to call home. In a world where climate cycles dictated the rhythm of existence, finding a place to endure the night was as critical as finding food or water. The land, while vast and varied, was not equally forgiving in all its corners. Some places offered protection from the elements and predators, others were open and exposed, leaving no refuge from the cold wind, the scorching sun, or the eyes of the hungry. Shelter was not a luxury for early humans, it was an unbroken necessity, a daily consideration woven into the structure of survival. Natural formations were often the first and most reliable refuges. Caves, carved over millennia by water or frost, provided a constant internal climate, cool in the heat of summer, warmer in the depths of winter. In regions where limestone or soft volcanic rock dominated, these voids could stretch far into the earth, offering multiple chambers, dry floors, and sometimes even access to underground streams. Archaeological sites such as those at Blombos Cave in South Africa and the caves of the Dordogne region in France reveal that such spaces were not only occupied for practical reasons, but eventually became centers of community life, storage, and in later ages, symbolic activity. Rock overhangs, though less enclosed, served a similar function, where sheer cliffs or boulders offered protection on one side. The addition of piled stones or woven branches could transform an overhang into a temporary dwelling. These formations were particularly valuable during seasonal migrations, when a group needed only a brief respite from wind or rain before continuing onward. Their accessibility also made them easier to abandon in a hurry if danger approached, a fact not lost on those who shared the landscape with lions, hyenas, or packs of wolves. In open country where neither caves nor rock shelters existed, early humans turned to the materials at hand. Temporary brush structures, often constructed from branches, grasses, and animal hides, could be assembled quickly and dismantled or abandoned without loss. In colder climates, these might be partially dug into the ground for insulation, the walls lined with moss or reeds, and the entrances faced away from prevailing winds. In warmer regions, shelters were built for shade and ventilation rather than heat retention. Frameworks of sticks draped with leaves or palm fronds to create pockets of cool air. Such constructions were rarely permanent, reflecting the mobility of the groups that built them. To remain in one place for too long risked exhausting local resources, attracting predators, or suffering from exposure when seasonal weather patterns shifted. Yet even the most temporary shelters carried evidence of planning and adaptation. The positioning of a structure often took into account the angle of the sun, the path of water runoff, and the visibility of approaching threats. Over generations, this practical knowledge accumulated, shaping traditions of shelter building that could be passed on to the young. The choice of shelter also depended on the broader environment. Along coasts, driftwood and seaweed could supplement stone and vegetation, while inland grasslands provided long stems for weaving and thatching. In wooded regions, fallen branches and bark served as the primary building materials, while in treeless tundra, bones from large animals could form the framework, covered in hides for insulation, an innovation that would become more prominent in later Ice Age cultures. Safety from predators was always a concern. Night was a time of heightened vulnerability, when eyesight failed, and the sounds of movement in the dark carried unsettling possibilities. Choosing a shelter with a narrow entrance, a raised position, or a defensible approach could mean the difference between a restful night and a desperate flight. Fires at the mouth of a cave or near the edge of a camp not only provided warmth and light, but also acted as a deterrent to many animals. Even before the mastery of fire, proximity to other group members served as a living barrier against intrusion. The collective awareness of many individuals forming a kind of shared perimeter. The importance of shelter extended beyond immediate survival. In the cold seasons, conserving heat reduced the body's energy expenditure, making food stores last longer and improving the odds of surviving lean times. In wet conditions, staying dry meant avoiding hypothermia and illness. Shelter also provided a space where tools could be made, food could be prepared, and injuries could be tended without the constant strain of exposure. It allowed for a degree of social stability, even if only for a few days or weeks at a time. Archaeological layers within ancient shelters tell silent stories of repeated occupation. Ash deposits from hearths, animal bones from meals, discarded stone flakes from tool making, and sometimes the remains of woven mats or bedding materials reveal patterns of use. These sites demonstrate that while early humans were mobile, they were not aimless. They returned to places that had proven their worth, marking them in memory as safe havens to seek out when the land or the season demanded it. In time, the lessons learned from natural shelters informed the development of more complex human-made dwellings. The knowledge of how to orient an entrance, how to insulate against cold or heat, and how to balance openness with concealment became part of the unspoken cultural toolkit. These lessons would eventually underpin the construction of semi-permanent settlements when the conditions of the Holocene allowed for agriculture and a less mobile existence. But long before that, in the Pleistocene and earlier, shelter remained a temporary adaptable solution to an ever-changing landscape. It was here, within these caves, beneath these overhangs, and under these humble brush structures, that generations learned the rhythms of survival. Here they endured storms, shared warmth, and passed on the unremarkable yet essential knowledge that kept them alive. And it was from these shelters that they ventured out each day into a world where danger and opportunity mingled in every direction. A world that required constant searching for food, water, and the next place to rest, leading them inevitably to the question of how to obtain nourishment when the land did not freely give it. From the shelter's shadow, early humans would step into the world carrying nothing that nature had directly provided in ready form, but rather objects they had shaped themselves, extensions of hand, arm, and intention. The acquisition of food was never a matter of mere reach or grasp. It demanded tools that could cut, pierce, scrape, and pound, each action separating nourishment from its protective shell of bone, hide, or fiber. Before such implements existed, survival relied on teeth, nails, and raw persistence. But these were never enough for a species without the speed of a cheetah or the claws of a bear. The earliest tools were deceptively simple, fractured stones with sharp edges, created by striking one rock against another in a deliberate, repeated way. Archaeological evidence from sites like Gona in Ethiopia, dated to about 2.6 million years ago, shows that these first flaked stones were not the product of accident, but of intention. They allowed hominins to slice through animal flesh more efficiently, to strip meat from bone, to cut fibrous plant material, and to work hides into coverings. The significance of these tools was not in their complexity, but in the fact that they marked a turning point, an externalization of physical ability into a crafted object. Over generations, these early stone flakes evolved into more carefully shaped implements. The Acheulean hand axe, appearing around 1.76 million years ago, was a leap in refinement. Symmetrical, teardrop-shaped, and laboriously flaked along both sides, it was versatile enough for butchering, digging for roots, cracking nuts, and even as a defensive weapon. Producing such a tool was not a matter of mere chance. It required foresight, the ability to visualize the finished form within the stone, and the patience to remove flake after flake until the shape emerged. This process could take hours, and errors could render a nearly complete piece unusable. The slow refinement of tools mirrored the slow pace of environmental adaptation. As early humans spread into varied landscapes, from open savannas to wooded river valleys, their toolkit expanded. Flake tools grew smaller and sharper for precise cutting. Scrapers emerged to process hides more thoroughly. Heavy choppers were developed for breaking open marrow-rich bones. In colder regions, these implements made it possible to fashion clothing from animal skins, enabling survival in climates far harsher than those of the equatorial homelands. Stone was the dominant medium, because it was durable, abundant, and held a sharp edge when fractured. Flint, obsidian, and quartzite were particularly valued for their workable qualities, though acquiring such materials sometimes required traveling significant distances or trading with neighboring groups. The presence of non-local stone at certain archaeological sites suggests that even in the deep past, humans recognized and sought out superior raw materials, incorporating such journeys into seasonal patterns of movement. The making of tools was not solely a solitary act. It is likely that knowledge of knapping techniques, the striking and shaping of stone, was passed from one individual to another, perhaps demonstrated in the quiet intervals between hunts or during the long hours of sheltering from adverse weather. The skill required meant that mastery was gradual, built over years of trial and observation. The act of creating a tool may also have reinforced social bonds, as a skilled knapper could provide for others in exchange for food, protection, or other forms of assistance. With the refinement of tools came an expansion of diet. A sharpened flake made it easier to access the marrow inside bones, a nutrient-rich resource. Choppers and pounding stones allowed the processing of nuts and tubers that would otherwise have been too hard to eat. Cutting implements facilitated the drying and preservation of meat, extending its usefulness beyond the day of the kill. Tools also allowed more efficient scavenging. Carcasses could be stripped quickly before competitors arrived, reducing the risk of dangerous encounters with large carnivores. Specialization began to appear not only in the tools themselves, but in their intended use. Some were better suited for butchery, others for woodworking or plant processing. Over time, composite tools emerged, wooden shafts tipped with stone points, increasing both reach and lethality in hunting. Though such innovations were far in the future of the earliest stone users, the gradual path toward them began with the humble flake and the patient shaping of hand axes. The importance of these developments cannot be overstated. With tools, early humans could alter their immediate environment in subtle but profound ways, cutting paths through dense vegetation, shaping branches into digging sticks, processing hides into coverings, and preparing food in forms more digestible and less hazardous. They could store energy for lean times, travel farther from shelter in search of food, and defend themselves more effectively. Each innovation reduced a fraction of the uncertainty that defined life. though never eliminating it entirely. In archaeological layers, the scatter of discarded flakes and broken tools forms a signature as clear as any written record. These remnants speak of trial, error, success, and the unbroken chain of teaching that carried knowledge forward. They tell of moments when a stone was turned in the hand, its shape considered, the next strike chosen with care. In those small decisions lay the seeds of technological progression, as each generation refined the craft just a little more than the last. From shelters of stone and brush, these early humans stepped into the landscape carrying tools of their own making, objects that allowed them to better secure food, to defend themselves, to manipulate their surroundings. But the making of tools alone did not fill the belly or quench thirst. The next task was one that carried equal parts opportunity and danger. The pursuit of nourishment in a world where many other creatures were faster, stronger, or more naturally equipped to take it. The pursuit of nourishment was never limited to the chase or the carcass. For all the skill that early humans developed in knapping stone and wielding it to hunt or scavenge, their survival leaned just as heavily on a quieter, slower practice, gathering what the land itself provided without struggle or pursuit. Across open grasslands, shaded forests and riverbanks, food grew in forms that neither fled nor fought, though even these required patience, knowledge, and care to obtain. Plant foods formed a substantial part of the early human diet, particularly before the development of complex hunting strategies, and even long afterward as a dependable supplement. Roots and tubers, hidden beneath the soil, offered concentrated energy in the form of starch. Berries and fruits, though often seasonal, provided sugars and essential vitamins. Nuts stored fat and protein in shells that could be cracked with the same pounding stones used for breaking bones. Edible leaves and shoots, though less calorically dense, supplied minerals and roughage that kept digestion functional in a meat-heavy diet. Identifying which plants could be safely eaten was not a matter of casual experimentation. Many regions contained species that looked inviting but were toxic or even deadly. Knowledge of safe plants was a cultural inheritance, passed through observation, imitation, and gradual accumulation of shared wisdom. A certain berry might be sweet in one season and bitter in another. A root might be nourishing when cooked but harmful when raw. Early humans would have learned to recognize signs of ripeness, seasonal availability, and the subtle cues, such as bitterness, milky sap, or certain odors, that warned of danger. In warm, humid climates, fruits and berries were often abundant, growing in thickets or on low-branching trees. In savanna regions, berries might appear for only a short span after rains, making them a resource to be consumed quickly or dried for later. Tubers could be dug from the ground during lean seasons when little else was available, their starches sustaining life when game was scarce. Such digging was labor-intensive, and often done with wooden sticks shaped and hardened at the tip, sometimes aided by stone flakes to cut through fibrous roots. Nuts offered another form of stored energy, particularly in forested or woodland environments. Shells were cracked between stones, yielding high-calorie kernels that could be eaten immediately, or stored in dry conditions for weeks. The hardness of some shells made nuts a food source more accessible to those with tools, underscoring again the connection between technological ability and dietary breadth. Preservation of plant foods was a challenge. Without pottery, storage depended on naturally dry conditions or on methods like drying fruits in the sun. Certain seeds and nuts could be kept in woven baskets, skin pouches, or even tucked into crevices of rock to protect them from moisture and pests. In colder regions or during cooler seasons, plant foods naturally lasted longer, extending the range of possible diets through the year. Foraging routes were often tied to the seasonal cycles of plants. A river valley might yield leafy greens in the spring, berries in early summer, and nut-bearing trees in the autumn. Groups learned to revisit productive areas at the right time of year, their movements forming a loose but predictable circuit over the landscape. In this way, plant foods not only sustained individuals, but also influenced patterns of migration and territory. The act of gathering was often a group activity, particularly involving those less suited to the physical demands or dangers of hunting, older individuals, children, and nursing mothers. This division of labor ensured that while some members of the group risked encounters with large animals in pursuit of meat, Others could reliably return with food from safer sources. Gathering trips still carried risks. Snakes in tall grass, insects capable of inflicting painful or infectious bites, or sudden weather changes that made travel back to shelter difficult. Foraging also required an acute memory for locations, seasons, and subtle environmental changes. A shift in the flowering time of a particular plant might indicate a change in rainfall patterns. The drying of a familiar stream could signal the need to seek food farther afield. The same attention to landscape that aided hunters in tracking prey allowed gatherers to recognize and adapt to these shifts. In many regions, plant foods formed a bridge between feasts and famine. After a successful hunt, they could be eaten alongside meat, adding variety and balancing nutrients. In lean times, they might form the bulk of what was available, keeping the body supplied with enough energy to endure until better opportunities arose. Over generations, this balance between hunting and gathering became not just a strategy but the foundation of early human subsistence. The role of foraging in survival cannot be overstated. Meat provided dense calories but was unpredictable in availability. Plants, though often requiring more time and effort to collect in sufficient quantities, could be counted on with greater regularity. Together they formed a complementary system, one in which the quiet patience of the gatherer was as vital as the persistence of the hunter. Yet both hunters and gatherers faced the same overarching challenge: the environment was never constant. Shifts in temperature, rainfall, and vegetation patterns could transform a once reliable food source into a rarity, forcing groups to move, adapt, or starve. These changes were not just seasonal but sometimes part of larger, slower transformations that shaped the very landscapes in which early humans lived. In landscapes where the vegetation thinned and the open ground stretched for miles, there were times when the bounty of plants could not sustain a group alone. The hunt, deliberate, dangerous, and often uncertain, became not just a way to secure food but a measure of cooperation, planning, and shared risk. Unlike gathering, which relied on the seasonal rhythms of plants, hunting was shaped by the movement of animals, whose patterns were far less predictable, and whose evasion was actively intentional. The earliest hunts were likely opportunistic. Carcasses left behind by lions, leopards, or hyenas could be approached once the predators had moved on. Though this was a gamble, scavengers such as vultures and jackals could strip meat quickly, and large carnivores sometimes lingered nearby, ready to defend their kill. In these moments, speed and alertness were essential. Stone flakes allowed the rapid cutting of meat from bone, and heavy pounding tools broke into the marrow-filled shafts before another competitor arrived. This scavenging provided high-value nutrition, particularly fats and proteins, but rarely in predictable or abundant amounts. Gradually, early humans moved from merely taking advantage of what other predators left behind to actively securing fresh meat themselves. Cooperative hunting was central to this transition. A single human without speed, claws, or large teeth stood little chance against most prey, but in groups, persistence and strategy could level the field. Archaeological evidence and studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies suggest that coordination, surrounding animals, driving them toward an ambush, or exhausting them through long chases, was a key development. Persistence hunting in particular relied on endurance rather than speed. While antelope or zebra could outpace a human in short sprints over long distances in heat, their ability to regulate body temperature faltered. Humans, with their capacity for sweat-based cooling and steady pace, could run prey to the point of exhaustion, making it easier to approach and deliver the killing blow with a club, spear, or thrown stone. This method, though effective, required deep knowledge of the animal's behavior, patience over hours of pursuit, and the cooperation of multiple hunters to prevent escape. Small game hunting often provided more reliable returns. Rabbits, birds, and reptiles could be caught with less risk and effort than large animals, sometimes using traps or nets woven from plant fibers. The remains of such tools are rare in the archaeological record, but indirect evidence, such as wear patterns on certain stones and plant impressions in ancient sediments, hints at their use. Spears with sharpened tips, sometimes hardened in fire, increased the range and lethality of attacks, while thrown stones allowed hunters to injure or drive smaller prey into waiting hands. The communal nature of the hunt meant that its spoils were also shared. In groups where hunting success was uncertain, sharing meat reduced the risk that any one individual would go without. This practice not only sustained nutritional balance within the group, but also reinforced bonds of reciprocity, a social glue that made cooperation in future hunts more likely. Success in the hunt was not simply measured in calories gained, but in the strengthening of ties that improved overall survival chances. Even when a hunt succeeded, the process of bringing the animal down was far from the end of the challenge. Butchering, especially of large animals, had to be done quickly to prevent spoilage and to avoid attracting dangerous predators. Fires, once controlled, could be lit nearby to deter scavengers, though in the earliest stages of human history, such protection relied more on vigilance and numbers than on flame. Transporting meat back to a shelter site required coordinated carrying, and sometimes involved cutting the carcass into manageable portions on the spot. The hunt also served as a form of environmental learning. Following animal tracks, reading the disturbance of grass, recognizing droppings, and noting where certain species came to drink were all skills honed over years of observation. These skills were transferable. The same attention to detail could guide foraging efforts, detect the approach of predators, or reveal changes in climate through shifts in migration patterns. The hunt, therefore, was both a physical act and a form of continuous education in the rhythms of the surrounding world. In lean seasons, hunting often blurred into scavenging once more, with groups shadowing predators at a distance, waiting for the moment when they could drive them from a kill. Such acts carried extreme risk. Lions and hyenas were not inclined to surrender their food peacefully, yet the rewards of fresh meat and marrow could mean the difference between survival and starvation. The willingness to take this risk was itself a measure of the precariousness of early human life. No resource could be dismissed when the margin between sustenance and hunger was so narrow. The evolution of hunting strategies over millennia marked a deepening of human ingenuity. From simple opportunism to coordinated pursuit, from the use of crude stones to shaped weapons and eventually projectiles, the hunt reflected a continuous interplay between environment, technology, and cooperation. Each improvement increased the chances of success, but none eliminated the uncertainty entirely. The world remained full of dangers and competitors, and the only constant was the need to adapt. As the skills of the hunt grew more sophisticated, so too did the demands of living with its consequences. Raw meat, once secured, could be eaten as it was, but this carried risks. Parasites, bacteria, and the difficulty of digesting certain tissues all posed threats. The solution to this would come not from sharper stones or faster legs, but from a different kind of mastery, the ability to harness and control one of nature's most transformative forces. The mastery of fire did not happen in a single moment, nor can it be traced to one group or one place. It began with encounters, not inventions, with the observation of a phenomenon that existed long before humans could control it. Lightning strikes could set dry grass ablaze, volcanic eruptions could send glowing rivers down a hillside, and friction between stones or wood in rare conditions could spark a smolder. For countless generations, fire was simply another feature of the natural world, feared as much as it was respected, its heat and light both destructive and alluring. Early humans likely learned to exploit fire long before they could create it at will. They may have carried burning branches from a naturally ignited wildfire back to a shelter, feeding it with dry grass and sticks to prolong its life. This required constant tending, as an unattended flame could die quickly, especially in damp or windy conditions. Maintaining fire was in itself a survival skill, keeping embers glowing overnight, shielding them from rain, and rekindling flames in the morning. The earliest clear archaeological evidence for the controlled use of fire by hominins appears at sites like Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, dated to roughly 1 million years ago, where ash deposits and charred bone fragments suggest deliberate burning within a sheltered space. Other finds, such as at Gesher Benot Yaakov in Israel, dated to around 780,000 years ago, show signs of repeated fire use, with burnt plant remains and flint tools heat-altered by proximity to flames. These discoveries point to a gradual, regionally varied adoption of fire, not an instant leap. The impact of fire on diet was profound. Cooking meat broke down connective tissues, making it easier to chew and digest, and it killed many harmful pathogens and parasites. The same was true for certain plant foods, roots and tubers that were fibrous and bitter when raw could become soft, sweet and far more digestible after roasting. The release of more calories from the same amount of food may have contributed to changes in human physiology, supporting larger brains and reducing the heavy jaw muscles that earlier hominins needed for raw diets. Beyond diet, fire changed the geography of safety. In the open night, flames created a perimeter of light that could deter some predators, particularly those wary of bright, flickering movement. Smoke carried a human presence farther than scent alone, warning other animals away. Within caves or rock shelters, a small fire could provide warmth through cold nights or seasons, making previously uninhabitable regions more accessible. This expanded the range of human migration, allowing survival in colder climates where reliance on body heat and animal skins alone would have been insufficient. The heat of fire also opened new possibilities for tool making. Hardening the tips of wooden spears in the flames increased their durability. Heat-treating certain stones could make them easier to flake into sharper edges. While these uses were likely discovered incidentally, a branch accidentally scorched in a fire pit, a stone cracking in the coals, they gradually became deliberate practices, expanding the technological repertoire of early humans. Equally significant, though less tangible, was the social dimension of fire. A communal hearth created a focal point for group life. People could gather in its light after the day's activities, sharing food and warmth. Stories, whether verbal or conveyed through gesture, could be told in the safety of its glow, fostering memory, teaching, and shared identity. This slow shift toward evening gatherings may have encouraged the development of language and deeper social bonds, as the night hours could be spent in interaction rather than solitary rest or darkness. Controlling fire also meant controlling time. With artificial light, the day could be extended beyond the limits of sunlight. Work on tools could continue into the evening, and group discussions could last without the looming need to retreat into sleep as soon as darkness fell. Fire allowed for a reorganization of daily rhythms, creating a more flexible balance between activity and rest. However, fire brought its own risks. In dry environments, an unattended flame could spread uncontrollably, destroying foraging grounds and driving away game. Smoke inhalation posed health hazards, particularly in enclosed shelters. Maintaining a fire required a steady supply of fuel, meaning that groups needed to balance its benefits against the labor of collecting wood or other burnable material. In regions where trees were sparse, this could limit how often fires were maintained. For a long time, the creation of fire from scratch remained elusive. Evidence suggests that the controlled use of fire long predated the ability to generate it at will. Once this skill, likely through friction methods such as bow drills or percussion between stones like flint and pyrite, became known, it represented a decisive turning point. Humans were no longer dependent on nature's unpredictable offerings. They could produce warmth, light, and cooked food whenever needed, wherever resources allowed. From this point onward, the relationship between humans and fire became permanent. It was no longer an occasional borrowed force, but an integral part of daily life. In time, it would be used not only for survival but for transformation, altering landscapes through controlled burns, hardening clay into pottery, smelting metals, and fueling the first industries. But in its earliest mastery, fire was a quiet revolution, a fragile glow that expanded the boundaries of where and how humans could live. Fire offered a measure of safety, but its circle of light could not push back every danger. Beyond its reach, in the blackness of prehistoric nights, movement continued. Eyes glimmered in the dark, not human eyes, but those of creatures far more accustomed to navigating without sight, relying instead on scent, sound, and an instinct honed over millions of years. Prehistoric humans lived in a landscape where they were not apex predators by default, but participants in a delicate and dangerous web, where the role of hunter could shift to hunted in moments. Among the most formidable threats were the large carnivores of the Pleistocene, many of them now extinct. Saber-toothed cats, such as Smilodon in the Americas and Homotherium across parts of Africa, Europe and Asia, possessed elongated upper canines capable of piercing the thick hides of large prey. Though often imagined as swift and reckless attackers, These cats were ambush predators, relying on concealment and short bursts of power rather than endurance. For humans moving through grasslands or forest edges, the threat lay in the sudden silent rush from cover, where even a single well-placed bite could be fatal. In Africa and Eurasia, giant hyenas like Pachycrocota brevirostris roamed in small groups or pairs, far larger than modern hyenas. They were powerful bone crushers, capable of seizing and killing mid-sized prey, but also adept scavengers. Their sense of smell and persistence meant that a kill made by humans could quickly draw unwanted attention. To abandon a carcass in such circumstances was to lose valuable food. To stay and defend it was to risk being overpowered. Crocodiles, too, presented hazards wherever rivers, lakes or wetlands were part of the landscape. Ancient relatives of today's Nile crocodile could grow to substantial lengths, their patience in waiting for prey as dangerous as their strength in striking. For humans gathering water, fishing or crossing shallow channels, the risk was ever present, a sudden snap from below the surface, capable of ending life in seconds. These predators were not solitary in their influence. Lions, leopards and cheetahs, in forms both ancestral and familiar, occupied overlapping territories with early humans. Packs of wolves and wild dogs worked cooperatively, pursuing prey across open ground. Bears, from brown bears to the massive cave bears of Eurasia, posed threats both at a distance and in direct competition for shelter. Even smaller predators, such as large birds of prey or snakes, could be dangerous to vulnerable members of a group, particularly children. To exist in such an environment required more than speed or strength. It required strategies of avoidance, deterrence, and collective defense. Many of these strategies mirrored those of other prey species: vigilance, movement in groups, and the use of terrain to limit approaches. Humans learned to position their camps near natural barriers, such as cliffs, dense vegetation, or bodies of water that could not easily be crossed by predators. In open areas they might choose slight elevations, where visibility was improved and approaching animals could be seen earlier. The use of fire as a deterrent was most effective at night, but during the day, humans relied on other measures, carrying tools or weapons, while foraging was not solely for hunting. A sharp-edged flake or a sturdy spear could also serve to warn or wound an attacker. In some cases, carcasses might be processed rapidly, with meat and marrow-bearing bones carried away from the kill site to avoid attracting attention. This behavior, observed even in other carnivores, reduced the risk of conflict over food. Scavenging itself carried dangers. Approaching the remains of a large animal often meant approaching the feeding grounds of predators. To secure such a resource, humans might coordinate movements, some individuals keeping watch while others worked to remove edible portions. Over time, this vigilance became a constant habit, the scanning of surroundings as much a part of daily activity as the work itself. Defensive cooperation extended to sheltering as well. Caves and rock overhangs, while protective from weather, could also be occupied by predators. Entering such spaces often required checking for signs of recent use, tracks, scat, or scent. If a large animal was present, the cost of confrontation was high. Even with fire, driving out a determined cave bear or hyena was risky. In some cases, evidence suggests that humans and predators alternated use of the same shelters seasonally, each avoiding the other when possible. This ever-present risk shaped the rhythms of life. Foraging routes were chosen with awareness of predator territories. Water sources were approached cautiously, often at times of day when certain hunters were less active. Movement in low light, dawn and dusk, was particularly dangerous, as it coincided with peak hunting activity for many carnivores. Even with all precautions, losses occurred. Injuries from predator encounters left marks on skeletal remains, punctures, scratches, and fractures consistent with bites or clawing. Some individuals survived such wounds, the healing recorded in bone, but others did not. Each incident reinforced the importance of caution and group cohesion, lessons passed not through formal teaching but through lived experience and observation. Over generations, these pressures contributed to behavioral adaptations that would endure long after many of the great predators were gone. The instinct to watch, to keep fire burning at night, to fortify sleeping areas, and to remain close to others in vulnerable moments became part of the unspoken code of survival. In this intricate web of predators and prey, humans learned to occupy a narrow but expanding niche, never fully safe, but increasingly capable of turning the balance in their favor. The next challenge would be not just avoiding harm, but creating more enduring forms of protection, both for the body and for the conditions of life itself. The struggle against predators was only one layer of the greater challenge. Even when danger slept, the land itself could become uninhabitable. Early humans lived within a world whose climate shifted not in centuries, but in seasons, and where survival often meant moving with the changing patterns of the earth. It was not simply a matter of choice. The cycles of wet and dry, of warm and cold, dictated the distribution of food and water. To remain too long in one place was to risk exhaustion of resources, or worse, to meet the season's extremes unprepared. Large grazing animals, antelope, aurochs, bison, reindeer, and countless others, followed predictable routes across the land in search of pasture. These herds were both a source of food and a living calendar for early humans. Where the animals went, fresh grazing grew. Where fresh grazing grew, other foraging opportunities emerged. To lose track of the herds was to fall out of sync with the land's provision. Seasonal migrations were not aimless wanderings. Over generations, knowledge accumulated, of which rivers dried first, of which valleys froze earliest, of which coastal areas yielded shellfish even in lean months. The group's elders, those who had survived multiple cycles of the seasons, carried mental maps that stretched across wide territories. Paths were chosen not merely for abundance but for safety, avoiding exposed plains during storm seasons or predator-dense valleys when certain prey were calving. The rhythm of movement varied by environment. In temperate grasslands, the shifts were subtle, moving gradually from highland summer ranges down to wintering grounds where snow fell later and melted earlier. In arid regions, the changes were starker, driven by the shrinking and swelling of rivers and lakes. Here humans might travel long distances between water sources, moving quickly to claim a safe spot before competing groups or animals arrived. Cold climates imposed their own demands. In Ice Age Europe, winters could not be endured in exposed open country without sufficient shelter and clothing. Groups might retreat into forested valleys, caves, or coastal areas where the moderating effect of the sea kept the cold less severe. Spring brought a reverse migration, following meltwater rivers upstream, where fresh vegetation and animal herds would soon appear. The movement itself carried its own hazards. Crossing unfamiliar ground increased the risk of encounters with predators or hostile groups. Rivers in flood, unstable ice, or treacherous terrain could slow progress or claim lives. The burden of transporting tools, food stores, and the very young or old required planning. For much of prehistory, no beasts of burden carried human loads. Every possession moved was carried on the back or in the arms. This made efficiency essential. Items without clear use were abandoned, and portable shelters or clothing took precedence over anything ornamental. Yet these migrations were also opportunities. Following animal herds meant proximity to fresh kills left by predators which could be scavenged. Moving through varied landscapes exposed groups to new plant resources, berries ripening in one region while already gone in another, edible tubers thriving in soils of different mineral content. Coastal migrations allowed seasonal harvesting of fish, seabirds, and mollusks, supplementing land-based diets. Water sources were central to these patterns. In dry seasons, humans gathered along the shrinking banks of rivers and lakes, sharing the same resource zones with animals of all sizes. Here, caution was essential, not only because predators were drawn to the same places, but because scarcity could provoke conflict with other human groups. In wetter seasons, when water was more widely available, these concentrations dispersed, reducing tension but also thinning the distribution of resources. Seasonal movement required a balance between predictability and flexibility. Routes were well known, but changes in climate or the movement of prey could disrupt the expected. A dry year could cause grasslands to fail earlier, forcing an earlier departure. A sudden cold snap could close off a mountain pass, trapping a group in less favorable territory. Those who adapted quickly, altering plans, seeking alternative routes, were more likely to survive and pass on their knowledge. Archaeological evidence for these migrations survives in the form of overlapping seasonal camps, layers of occupation debris showing repeated return to the same places over years or centuries. Stone tools fashioned from materials sourced far from the camp indicate the distances traveled, while isotopic analysis of human and animal bones reveals shifts in diet consistent with seasonal changes in available foods. These journeys were part of a long, slow rhythm, repeated across countless generations. The distances varied. Some groups moved only within a few hundred square kilometers, others traversed vast ranges over the course of a year, but all were guided by the land's cycles. This rhythm, learned over millennia, created a deep familiarity with the terrain, embedding roots and landmarks into the memory of entire communities. With each year's migration, individuals passed through landscapes that bore the traces of earlier lives, old hearth sites, abandoned stone flakes, the bones of kills long since stripped clean. These remnants were silent reminders that survival was not an isolated effort, but part of a continuous thread stretching back to ancestors who had walked the same paths, braved the same winters, and watched the same herds vanish over distant ridges. As the world shifted from one season to the next, humans followed, not yet masters of their environment, but skilled navigators within it. The path of survival was still determined by the land's will, and with every migration came new challenges to shelter, safety, and endurance. As the cycles of movement etched familiar paths across the land, the survival of the group depended not only on where they went, but on how they moved together. No single person could watch for danger, track game, tend to children, and navigate the terrain all at once. The effort required a shared understanding, a way to coordinate action and pass knowledge between individuals. Long before structured language emerged, early humans relied on the oldest form of communication available to them, the body itself. A pointed finger, an urgent glance, the sudden stillness of posture, all could convey meaning more quickly than sounds. A subtle tilt of the head toward a rustle in the grass might be enough to alert the watchful without alarming prey or predator. Hand gestures could indicate the direction of movement, the approach of danger, or the readiness to act. In many ways, these cues still linger in human behavior today, a quiet inheritance from a time when words did not yet exist. Alongside these gestures, vocal sounds formed another layer of early communication. Before the structured phonemes of language, there were varied tones, pitches, and rhythms, grunts, hums, sharp exhalations, and drawn-out calls. Some conveyed urgency, others reassurance. A certain pattern might signal the presence of water, another the proximity of dangerous animals. Over time, these sounds became more nuanced, shaped by repetition and the shared experiences of the group. This proto-language allowed for a degree of cooperation that set early humans apart from other predators and foragers. Coordinated hunting, for example, relied on silent cues when stalking, and carefully chosen sounds when flushing prey into traps or ambushes. Scavenging required alerting others to a find without attracting the attention of larger predators. In migration, signals could indicate the need to slow down, change direction, or group more tightly in unfamiliar terrain. The need for communication also extended beyond immediate survival. Early humans, like other primates, formed strong social bonds, grooming behaviors, inherited from earlier hominins, and shared with other great apes, served not only to maintain hygiene, but to reinforce trust and reduce social tension. Touch was a language of its own, conveying belonging and security. The act of sharing food, too, was a statement, one that bound the group together and acknowledged mutual dependence. Knowledge transfer, even without formal language, was vital. Younger members learned the habits of prey, the seasonal shifts in edible plants, and the locations of safe shelters through observation, imitation, and subtle correction from elders. Demonstrations were silent lessons, a hunter showing how to shape a stone flake by the angle of a blow, or a forager displaying a freshly dug root before replanting a part to ensure future growth. Some researchers suggest that the beginnings of symbolic thought, the capacity to let one thing stand for another, emerged alongside these communication systems. Certain sounds or gestures may have started to represent abstract ideas rather than just immediate physical realities. A gesture for danger could apply not only to a predator in sight, but to a remembered encounter. Such developments laid the groundwork for more complex forms of thought, memory, and eventually, spoken language. The shape of the early human vocal tract also played a role. While Australopithecines and some early Homo species may have lacked the full range of sounds possible in modern humans, they still possessed the ability to vary pitch and volume in ways more complex than most other animals. The gradual reshaping of the hyoid bone and other anatomical structures over hundreds of thousands of years expanded this range, allowing for more precise vocal control and paving the way for true language. In the quiet of night, when the group gathered around a small fire or huddled in a sheltered space, communication likely shifted in tone. Soft murmurs, low hums and slow gestures may have been used to soothe children, share memories of the day's events, or prepare for the next day's movement. These moments reinforced identity, not just as a collection of individuals, but as a community with a shared past and future. Archaeological traces of early communication are difficult to find, but indirect evidence exists. The complexity of coordinated hunts, the creation of specialized tools, and the transmission of fire-making techniques all suggest the presence of systems for sharing knowledge. Even the migration patterns visible in the archaeological record point to the need for sustained organized cooperation. In this world, communication was as much about survival as food or shelter. Without it, the group would fracture, coordination would fail, and opportunities would be lost. But with it, even without formal language, early humans could move as a single organism, seeing through many eyes, hearing through many ears, and acting through many hands. And as these bonds deepened and the means of sharing information became more refined, new possibilities emerged. The ability to work materials in ways never seen before, to craft protections against a hostile environment, and to shape the body's covering, not just for warmth, but for endurance, also meant knowing where that endurance could be maintained. Food and shelter could be found in many forms, but without water, survival shrank from days to hours. From the earliest moments of human existence, proximity to fresh water was not just a convenience, it was the spine along which life itself was aligned. In the deep prehistory of humanity, rivers, lakes and springs were more than landmarks. They were the silent heartbeats of the land, pulsing with the cycles of rain, meltwater, and underground flow. To settle near them was to accept both their bounty and their dangers. A bend in a river might offer fish, reeds, and a soft bank for resting, but it might also be a place where predators came to drink, or where flooding could erase a camp overnight. Seasonal changes shaped these water sources in ways that demanded memory and adaptation. In wet seasons, rivers could swell until they spilled across their banks, creating new channels and marshes. In dry seasons, streams might shrink to narrow trickles or disappear entirely, leaving behind only shallow pools warmed by the sun and clouded with silt. Early humans learned to track these changes, to remember which depressions in the earth held water longest, which springs flowed even during the harshest droughts, and which seasonal rivers returned like clockwork after the rains. Some of this knowledge came through generations of observation, embedded in the migratory patterns of the group. The route from one shelter to the next was not always the shortest distance, but the one that touched upon known, dependable water points. In arid regions, such as parts of prehistoric Africa, a miscalculation could mean traveling under an unyielding sun with nothing to drink for far too long. Such mistakes were not always survivable. Water was also a place of opportunity. Lakes and slow-moving rivers often supported a dense variety of edible life: fish, mollusks, amphibians, aquatic plants, all of which provided vital nutrition and could be gathered with relatively little risk compared to large game hunting. The remains of ancient fish hooks and harpoons found at sites tens of thousands of years old hint at the ingenuity early humans applied to these water-based resources. Yet water was never entirely safe. Crocodiles, snakes, and other predators shared the need to drink and feed there, turning a moment of necessity into a potential ambush. The act of approaching a riverbank required vigilance, one person bending to fill a skin or gourd, while others kept watch for the telltale ripples or shifting shadows that signaled danger. In colder climates and glacial periods, water's role shifted, but remained essential. Melting ice and snow fed streams that ran cold and fast, sometimes cutting deep gorges into the land. Here, fresh water was plentiful, but access could be treacherous. Falling into frigid waters could sap warmth and strength so quickly that escape was uncertain. As a result, early humans in these regions developed strategies for drawing water safely, using long branches or carefully breaking river ice rather than leaning dangerously close to the edge. Springs held a special significance. Some bubbled up from deep underground aquifers, their temperatures more constant than surface water. They could remain unfrozen in winter or persist during droughts, making them invaluable in harsh environments. Archaeological evidence suggests that such springs often became repeated gathering points over thousands of years, their importance preserved in the collective memory of migrating bands. The connection between water and settlement shaped human dispersal across continents. As Homo erectus, Neanderthals and later Homo sapiens expanded their ranges, they often followed river valleys, natural corridors rich in resources, easier to navigate than rugged uplands. These waterways became the silent guides of migration, leading populations into new territories while ensuring a reliable anchor of survival. Water also held less tangible roles: the sounds of a river or lake, the shimmering reflection of the sky, the patterns of aquatic life, all formed part of the sensory map by which humans understood their world. In some archaeological interpretations, certain ancient sites near water may have had ritual or symbolic significance, though the specifics remain beyond our knowing. Even without permanent settlements, the relationship with water was intimate and constant. Early containers, animal skins, hollowed gourds, woven plant baskets lined with resin, allowed groups to carry water over short distances, extending the reach of foraging trips or hunts. In arid landscapes, knowledge of how to locate hidden water, by reading animal tracks, following bird flight patterns or digging in dry riverbeds, could make the difference between returning to camp and perishing. Over time, as human toolmaking and planning grew more sophisticated, water would become not just a source of sustenance, but a strategic asset. Control of a spring or river crossing meant control of life itself. But in these earlier stages, it was still a shared necessity, as much a part of the group's identity as the shelters they built or the tools they carried. The path from one water source to another often defined the very rhythm of movement, dictating when a group would rise, how far it would travel in a day, and where it would stop to rest. And along these paths, under the sun and over the seasons, new materials were found: plant fibers, animal hides, and the means to weave or bind them into coverings that shielded skin from wind, rain, and cold. The wind shifted over the camp, carrying with it the faint scent of decay from somewhere beyond the edge of the known path. Death was never a distant possibility for early humans. It moved among them as constantly as hunger or thirst, woven into the very fabric of existence. Injuries from hunts, illnesses brought on by cold or contaminated water, the sudden violence of predators, or the slow weakening of age, all could claim a life at any time. In the precarious balance of survival, loss was inevitable. And yet, even in these earlier stages, traces remain that suggest humans began to respond to death with more than mere abandonment. The archaeological record offers scattered but profound hints of this early awareness. The remains of Homo naledi, found deep within the Rising Star cave system in South Africa, have been interpreted by some researchers as evidence of deliberate body placement, perhaps an early form of ritual disposal, though the interpretation remains debated. More conclusive are the sites associated with Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens, where bodies appear to have been intentionally buried, sometimes in positions suggesting care or arrangement, rather than random collapse. In Shanidar Cave, in what is now Iraq, the skeletons of Neanderthals dating back roughly 60,000 years have been found with pollen traces that some scholars interpret as evidence of flowers placed with the dead. While the exact meaning of this is contested, the pollen might have been introduced by burrowing rodents. The possibility remains that even in this distant time, there was an impulse to mark the passing of a life with something more than disposal. Death for early humans was not only the end of an individual, but a shift in the fragile structure of the group. A skilled hunter gone meant fewer resources. A gatherer lost meant a gap in knowledge about where to find certain routes or which waterholes were safe. The elderly, though less physically active, could hold vital information about seasonal changes, predator movements, or the use of medicinal plants. Their deaths too carried weight beyond the emotional, altering the survival calculus for those who remained. Evidence from sites like Kofsa Cave in Israel, dated to about 100,000 years ago, shows burials where the dead were placed in shallow pits, and sometimes accompanied by items such as red ochre or tools. The inclusion of such objects hints at a recognition of the individual beyond their physical function, perhaps an acknowledgement of identity, memory, or a sense that something of the person might continue elsewhere. The decision to bury, rather than leave remains exposed, may also have served practical purposes. A decomposing body could attract scavengers or spread disease. Burial offered a way to protect the living, but the care taken in some burials, positioning of the body, use of pigments, inclusion of personal artifacts, points to a deeper layer of meaning. Here we see the earliest signs of symbolic thought applied to the most unyielding reality of life. In colder regions, where the ground might be too frozen to dig, bodies may have been covered with stones or placed in natural depressions, shielded from scavengers by rock and soil. In some coastal areas, where shells and sand were abundant, the covering might have been softer, but no less intentional. These practices, repeated over generations, would have reinforced social bonds, linking the living to their dead, and perhaps marking certain places as significant in the landscape. Ritual, if it can be called that in these early forms, likely had no fixed structure. It may have been as simple as arranging the body, placing a stone at its head, or scattering a handful of colored earth. But such acts required time and intention, both rare commodities in a world where survival was the constant focus. This suggests that the impulse to treat death differently from other aspects of life was already strong enough to override the immediate pressures of foraging, hunting, or moving on. Some anthropologists suggest that early treatment of the dead might have helped groups cope psychologically with loss. In a small band, the death of even one member could disrupt emotional stability. A shared act of burial or marking might have helped reaffirm social unity, reminding the group that life continued despite absence. Over time, such practices could have evolved into more structured rituals, eventually giving rise to the complex funerary customs seen in later prehistoric and historic societies. The first encounters with death would also have been encounters with the mystery of where life goes when it ends. While we cannot know the thoughts of those early humans, the physical evidence of deliberate body treatment suggests an awareness that death was not merely a biological event, but something worthy of attention and perhaps reverence. The use of red ochre, for example, found in some of the oldest burials, may have been symbolic, representing blood, life force, or transformation. This pigment, valued for its striking color and durability, required effort to obtain, making its presence at burial sites even more significant. Not all treatment of the dead was gentle. In some contexts, evidence of defleshing, dismemberment, or burning suggests practices that could have been practical, ritualistic, or both. In resource-scarce environments, such acts might have been linked to survival, avoiding predators, preventing disease, or even, controversially, cannibalism in extreme cases. But in other cases, cut marks or other modifications may have been part of symbolic processing of the body, a way of engaging with death that had cultural meaning. Over tens of thousands of years, these varied responses to death marked a turning point in human cognitive and social development. The ability to imagine something beyond immediate survival, to invest time and energy into honoring or containing the dead, reflects a growing complexity of thought. It hints at the earliest foundations of belief systems, memory, and identity, as more than the sum of physical parts. The landscapes in which these burials occurred often became more than mere campsites. A cave that held the remains of ancestors might be returned to again and again, becoming a place of significance in seasonal migrations. Open plains where cairns of stone marked graves might also serve as navigational points or memory markers. In this way, death, once only an interruption, became a subtle anchor in the human relationship with place. As the millennia passed, these encounters with mortality would intertwine with the development of symbolic expression, shaping not only how early humans lived, but how they imagined the unseen. And from those first arrangements of stone and earth, from the faint stains of ochre and the scattered shells would grow the earliest sparks of meaning that transcended survival, leading naturally into the need to mark, to carve, to paint. The slow pulse of time in the prehistoric world measured change not in decades, but in the passing of countless generations. Innovation was not a sudden flash, but an incremental accumulation, each small adjustment born of necessity, tested by trial, and kept alive only if it worked. The long march of human ingenuity began with hands that chipped stone, and over millennia, those hands learned to coax more from the materials at their disposal, sharper edges, more durable shapes, and tools better suited to specific tasks. The earliest stone tools, known from Oldowan sites over 2 million years old, were little more than sharp flakes struck from a core, useful for slicing meat from bone or cutting fibrous plants. But the principle was established. With effort, a raw material could be reshaped to serve a purpose. The Acheulean hand axe, emerging perhaps 1.7 million years ago, and used for over 1 million years, represented one of the first great refinements. A symmetrical, teardrop-shaped tool, crafted with deliberate precision, rather than random chipping. These hand axes were multi-purpose implements, butchering animals, digging for tubers, or shaping wood into digging sticks and spears. The pace of change was glacial by modern standards. A tool design could persist for hundreds of thousands of years, passed from one generation to the next with minimal variation. But within these slow currents, subtle improvements crept in. Flakes struck more carefully to create finer edges, tips thinned for better penetration, and grips shaped to fit the curve of a hand. In some regions, new techniques like the level-or method allowed the shaping of flakes of predetermined size and shape, a leap forward in planning and foresight. Alongside stone tools came other advances, often invisible in the archaeological record, because they were made from perishable materials: wooden spears, baskets woven from reeds, and nets knotted from plant fibers. The Schöningen spears from Germany, dating to around 300,000 years ago, survive as rare evidence of such craftsmanship, carefully balanced, streamlined, and fire-hardened for hunting large game. Clothing, too, emerged slowly, likely first from the necessity of protection rather than modesty. The earliest coverings may have been draped animal hides, softened by repeated working, and held in place by thongs or sinew ties. As humans ventured into colder environments during glacial periods, the need for warmth became critical. Scrapers, used to clean and soften hides, are found throughout Paleolithic sites, suggesting the preparation of skins was a well-established skill. Over time, hides were cut to shape and sewn with bone needles, as seen in later Upper Paleolithic cultures, producing fitted garments that could retain body heat more efficiently. Food preservation, while rudimentary, began with the simplest methods: drying meat in the sun, or near a fire, smoking it over slow embers, or storing it in cool caves or buried pits. Such techniques extended the availability of food beyond the immediate moment of a kill or harvest, an essential advantage during lean seasons. Fat, marrow, and high-energy foods like nuts could be kept for weeks or months with minimal spoilage if protected from moisture and scavengers. The development of storage containers, from woven baskets to hollowed gourds, from leather bags to clay vessels in later prehistoric periods, expanded the possibilities for transport and delayed consumption. Even before pottery emerged, the concept of keeping food for later, rather than consuming it immediately, marked a cognitive shift, a recognition that the present could be planned for, in anticipation of the future. This long march of innovation was not evenly distributed. Different groups, separated by geography, climate, and available resources, developed at their own pace and along divergent paths. What was possible in a dense forest differed from what could be made on an open steppe. The skills needed to hunt reindeer in the far north were unlike those required to spear fish in tropical rivers. Yet across these varied landscapes, the underlying impulse was the same: to improve the odds of survival through small cumulative acts of invention. Even seemingly minor adjustments could have significant consequences. A better spear point meant a cleaner kill. A hide more thoroughly scraped meant a warmer covering. A sturdier basket meant more berries gathered in less time. These gains, multiplied over generations, allowed humans to push into new territories, endure harsher conditions, and maintain more stable group sizes. By the Upper Paleolithic, some 50,000 years ago, the pace of technological change began to accelerate. Blades replaced simple flakes, bone and antler were carved into specialized tools, and composite weapons combined multiple materials for greater effectiveness. Clothing became more tailored, sometimes adorned with decorative elements that hinted at symbolic as well as functional uses. Food storage evolved with the creation of pits lined with stone or clay, and in some areas, large-scale smoking racks allowed for preservation on a greater scale. Each innovation, however small, was a thread in the tapestry of survival. The making of a sharper edge, the sewing of a warmer garment, the storing of meat for winter. These were acts that connected the living to those who came before, carrying forward skills honed through uncounted repetitions. And just as tools and techniques shaped the human body and mind, they also reshaped human relationships. Those who crafted the best tools might gain status. Those who knew the best preservation methods might become essential in hard times. This steady refinement of practical knowledge laid the foundation for the next great transformation in human existence. The ability not only to endure the environment, but to mark it, to express meaning through forms that went beyond the purely functional. From the edge of a tool to the curve of a carved bone, the human hand would begin to shape not only objects of necessity, but also objects of thought. The landscapes of early human existence were never fixed. They shifted under the slow but relentless influence of climate cycles, tectonic movements, and ecological succession. What was once an open savanna teeming with grazing herds might, over centuries, transform into arid steppe, or a dense forest, or even be buried beneath advancing glacial ice. These changes occurred on a scale that defied individual memory. No single hunter or gatherer would see the full transformation, yet their cumulative impact shaped the course of human survival. During glacial periods, vast ice sheets advanced over northern latitudes, locking away enormous volumes of water and lowering sea levels by more than 100 meters. Coastal plains emerged, connecting continents and creating migration routes now hidden beneath the ocean. At the same time, much of the Earth's landmass beyond the ice fronts turned cold and dry, favoring grasses over trees and concentrating grazing animals into more predictable patterns. These were good times for hunters adapted to open country pursuit, but they demanded clothing, shelter, and fuel sources capable of sustaining life in bitter cold. In such regions, groups relied more heavily on animal fat and protein, supplemented by the hardy roots and tubers that could survive beneath frozen soil. When the ice receded during interglacial periods, forests spread into former grasslands, seas rose to flood coastal corridors, and rainfall patterns shifted. In warmer, wetter climates, plant diversity increased, offering a wider variety of fruits, nuts, and leafy greens. Hunting in forests required different strategies: stealth, knowledge of animal tracks, and weapons better suited to close-range encounters. The tools that excelled in open plains, long balanced spears for throwing, were less effective here. Instead, shorter, more maneuverable weapons, snares and traps became more important. Deserts also expanded and contracted in rhythm with climate shifts. In the Sahara, for example, there were periods in the distant past when the region supported lakes, grasslands, and abundant wildlife, drawing human populations into areas now barren and hostile. As aridity increased, groups were forced to migrate toward shrinking water sources or retreat entirely to more hospitable regions. Survival in desert environments meant traveling light, knowing where seasonal springs might emerge, and making use of every edible resource, from drought-resistant tubers to the marrow of small desert mammals. In tundra landscapes, dominated by mosses, lichens, and short grasses, humans followed herds of reindeer, mammoth, or bison across great distances. These environments offered little in the way of edible plant life for humans, and so reliance on animal resources was almost absolute. Tools here were adapted for processing hides into layered clothing, for carving bone and ivory into needles and awls, and for building shelters from mammoth bones covered in thick hides when wood was scarce. Fuel could be scavenged driftwood, dried animal dung, or even the bones of prey burned for heat. The ability to adapt diets was as important as adjusting tools. A group accustomed to a high-protein diet in tundra conditions could not survive long in a tropical rainforest without learning to exploit the abundant plant foods, fish, and small arboreal game. Likewise, those from wetter, forested environments faced challenges in the arid steppe, where edible plants were sparse and hunting required following widely roaming herds. Adaptation meant observing the behavior of local wildlife, learning seasonal patterns of plant growth, and passing this knowledge through generations. Human movement patterns became a form of adaptation in themselves. Some groups adopted a highly nomadic existence, ranging widely to track seasonal food sources or to escape inhospitable weather. Others, particularly in resource-rich environments, settled for longer periods, developing more specialized tools and deeper ecological knowledge of a smaller area. Flexibility was key. A river valley that could support semi-permanent camps for decades might be abandoned in a single season if flood patterns changed or a drought set in. Cultural adaptation went hand in hand with environmental adjustment. In colder climates, clothing styles evolved to conserve heat more efficiently, often in multiple layers. In wetter climates, water-resistant hides or plant fibers were used to shield against rain. Shelter construction reflected available materials. Caves in limestone regions, brush huts in savannas, hide tents on the steppe, and wooden lean-tos in boreal forests. Even the social structure of groups could shift with the landscape. Open plains encouraged larger cooperative hunting parties, sometimes bringing together multiple bands for seasonal hunts. Dense forests or deserts, with more scattered resources, tended to favor smaller, more mobile groups. These social patterns influenced not only survival strategies, but also the flow of knowledge and technology between groups. Some adaptations were technological in nature, others were behavioral. In resource-scarce environments, humans learned to exploit every part of an animal: hides for shelter and clothing, bones for tools, sinews for bindings, fat for fuel, and even stomach linings for carrying water. In plant-rich environments, processing techniques expanded to remove toxins from otherwise inedible species, such as leaching tannins from acorns or boiling tubers to neutralize bitter compounds. Throughout these changes, one constant remained: the need to anticipate the environment's next move. Though prehistoric humans could not predict the slow grind of geological time or the long arc of climate cycles, they could read the more immediate signs: animal migrations, flowering times, the drying of seasonal streams, and adjust accordingly. The skill lay in interpreting these signs correctly, making decisions that balanced risk and reward. Moving too soon could mean abandoning resources prematurely. Waiting too long could mean starvation or death from exposure. The cumulative effect of this adaptability was profound. It allowed humans to spread far beyond the tropical and subtropical environments in which they had evolved, reaching into regions with extreme cold, heat, or seasonal variability. It laid the groundwork for future expansions across continents, through deserts, over mountain ranges, and eventually across icebound seas. And it fostered the kind of flexible thinking that would in time allow humans not only to adjust to their surroundings but to reshape them. Yet for millions of years, reshaping the land remained beyond reach. The forests, tundras, deserts, and plains dictated the terms of life, and humans moved upon the landscape like any other species, bound to its cycles and limitations. Each shift in climate, each alteration in the land's character, was another test in a long series, and each survival was another step in the slow, unbroken march that would lead to the next great expression of human capability, not in the form of adaptation to the land, but in the form of leaving a mark upon it. The bonds of survival in the prehistoric world extended far beyond bloodlines. While the earliest human and pre-human societies likely began as small family units, parents, offspring, and perhaps a few closely related individuals, the pressures of a challenging and unpredictable environment encouraged connections with those outside one's immediate kin. Cooperation between unrelated groups was not an automatic instinct. It had to be learned, tested, and reinforced through mutual benefit. But once established, it became one of the most powerful tools early humans possessed, enabling them to share resources, exchange knowledge, and defend themselves against both the dangers of the natural world and the uncertainties of scarcity. The first stirrings of such cooperation may have come from chance encounters at reliable resource points. a bend in a river where fish were plentiful, a seasonal spring in a dry valley, or the migratory path of large game. These locations acted as meeting places for multiple bands, each drawn by the same environmental pull. At first, such meetings may have been tense, with groups wary of competition or theft. But over time, patterns of coexistence emerged, a tacit understanding that sharing a space, at least temporarily, could yield better outcomes than driving rivals away. From these encounters, simple forms of alliance developed. Groups might agree to hunt in the same general region, but focus on different prey species, avoiding direct competition. They might share the labor of butchering a large animal, distributing meat in proportions agreed upon through custom. In times of abundance, such arrangements were relatively easy to maintain. The real test came during scarcity, when the temptation to guard resources jealously grew strong. It was in these leaner times that the true value of cooperation became evident. A group that shared surplus in one season could count on reciprocal aid when fortunes reversed. The exchange of materials was an important extension of these alliances. Prehistoric humans did not yet have formal trade systems in the modern sense, but they recognized the value of items from other regions, a particularly fine stone for making blades, a type of shell found only on distant shores, a plant fiber stronger than those available locally. Such goods likely moved along loose networks of exchange, passed from group to group during seasonal meetings or in the course of overlapping migrations. The spread of obsidian volcanic glass prized for its sharp edges over great distances in the archaeological record is one of the clearest indicators of such exchanges in deep prehistory. Alongside physical materials, knowledge itself became a tradable and shareable resource. The techniques for shaping a better spear point, identifying an edible but obscure plant, or tracking an animal across challenging terrain could be learned from outsiders as well as from one's own kin. In this way, cultural innovations spread more rapidly than they would have if each group had been entirely isolated. The slow pace of technological change in prehistory should not obscure the fact that information exchange was a vital force in human adaptation and expansion. Cooperative hunting was perhaps the most dramatic and visible expression of these intergroup alliances. Certain prey animals, mammoth, bison, or large deer, required more people to surround, drive, and kill than a single family unit could supply. By coordinating with neighboring groups, humans could stage hunts of impressive scale, using lines of beaters to push herds toward natural traps like ravines or swamps. The meat from such hunts would be far more than one band could consume before spoilage, and sharing it strengthened the bonds between participating groups. Socially, these gatherings offered more than just practical benefits. They provided opportunities for forming bonds between individuals from different groups, sometimes through partnerships that linked lineages. Mating outside the immediate family circle reduced the risk of inbreeding and increased genetic diversity, a subtle but important advantage over long spans of time. The mingling of families also meant the mingling of ideas, beliefs, and customs, knitting together a wider cultural fabric. Symbolic elements may have played a role in reinforcing these cooperative ties. Shared marks on tools, similar styles of personal adornment, or the mutual use of certain pigments for body decoration could act as visual signals of alliance or mutual recognition. Such symbols, simple though they may have been, help distinguish friend from stranger in a world where the wrong assumption could be fatal. Of course, cooperation was never absolute. Disputes arose over access to hunting grounds, water sources, or especially valuable materials. Tensions might flare into skirmishes, and alliances could fracture if the balance of benefit shifted too far in one direction. Yet the fact that cooperation persisted despite these challenges speaks to its enduring advantages. Over generations, humans learned that the web of mutual aid could stretch far beyond the immediate circle of kinship, and that survival was often more secure when shared. In some regions, archaeological evidence suggests that cooperative networks spanned impressive distances. Similar tool-making styles appearing across hundreds of kilometers hint at sustained contact between far-flung groups. The movement of non-local stone, bone, and shell materials reinforces the picture of a world in which early humans were not isolated pockets, but participants in a loose but functional web of alliances. This gradual widening of cooperative behavior had far-reaching implications. It laid the groundwork for more complex forms of social organization, from seasonal gatherings to early trade routes, and eventually to the interdependent societies that would emerge thousands of years later. In the prehistoric world where each day was a negotiation with the forces of nature, the ability to extend trust, cautiously, conditionally, but purposefully, beyond one's family was nothing short of revolutionary. And with these bonds in place, humans were better prepared to face the next step in their shared journey, the slow, deliberate crossing into new and unfamiliar lands, where survival would depend not just on skill and adaptability, but on the strength of these hard-won connections. The slow expansion of early humans from their African homelands into the vast and varied terrains of other continents was not a single dramatic event, but rather a drawn-out series of movements measured in generations. It was less a purposeful march toward distant horizons, and more an accumulation of small steps, each dictated by immediate needs. The search for fresh water, the pull of migrating herds, the lure of a warmer valley during a cold season, or the gentle pressure of an expanding population that made familiar grounds less abundant in resources. Over tens of thousands of years, these small shifts in territory produced a gradual but inexorable spread, carrying human populations along river valleys, across open plains, and eventually into the forests, mountains and coasts of lands far from their point of origin. Africa remained the cradle for much of this history, its varied climates and ecosystems nurturing the earliest members of the genus Homo. Yet, even within the continent, migration was a constant feature. Bands shifted in response to seasonal changes in rainfall, moving between wet season pastures and dry season refuges. Some followed great rivers like the Nile, whose shifting courses over millennia carved paths through otherwise arid landscapes, creating corridors rich in plant and animal life. Others hugged the edges of lakes, where fish, waterfowl, and edible plants provided a dependable food supply, even when the surrounding plains grew dry and barren. The first tentative steps beyond Africa likely occurred in windows of favorable climate. During wetter periods, regions that are now arid deserts could bloom with grasses and shrubs, easing passage for both humans and the animals they depended on. Archaeological evidence suggests that early members of Homo erectus began leaving Africa more than 1.8 million years ago, dispersing into the Levant, the Arabian Peninsula, and onward into Asia. These movements were not migrations in the modern sense, with set origins and destinations, but slow expansions of territory by populations whose boundaries were defined by what could be reached on foot within the needs of daily life. Coastal routes offered some of the easiest paths forward. The shorelines provided consistent resources: shellfish, seaweed, fish trapped in tidal pools, and often milder climates than the continental interiors. Following these coasts, humans could move steadily into new regions without losing the security of familiar foods. Inland river valleys served a similar role, acting as natural highways through challenging terrain. Rivers not only provided water and food, but also carved navigable routes between mountain ranges and through thick forests. The crossing into Eurasia brought early humans into contact with environments unlike anything they had known in Africa. Open grasslands stretched for hundreds of kilometers, home to herds of grazing animals whose movements followed seasonal cycles. Forests in temperate regions offered new edible plants and new prey, but also new predators and diseases. In colder latitudes, survival required learning to cope with snow, ice, and extended winters. The adaptation to such conditions did not happen overnight. It was the work of many generations, each making small adjustments in tools, shelter, clothing, and diet. The spread into colder regions demanded more than just following herds. It required foresight, the ability to store food for leaner times, and the use of insulating materials like animal hides. The archaeological record shows gradual improvements in clothing-making techniques and the use of shelters capable of holding heat, both of which would have been essential for survival during Ice Age winters. In some areas, people took advantage of natural formations such as caves, which not only shielded them from the elements, but also served as long-term seasonal bases from which to hunt and forage. While the journey into new lands was often shaped by the pull of opportunity, it was equally driven by necessity. Changes in climate could transform once rich areas into inhospitable terrain, forcing groups to move on. Over millennia, cycles of glaciation lowered sea levels, exposing land bridges between continents. These fleeting connections, such as the one that once linked Siberia to Alaska, opened new paths for migration. When sea levels rose again, these routes vanished beneath the waves, sealing off some populations from their ancestral homes and compelling them to adapt in isolation. The arrival of humans in remote or extreme environments, from the cold steppes of Central Asia to the rugged coastlines of Southeast Asia, required not only physical endurance but also the ability to transmit survival knowledge across generations. Each new landscape brought unique challenges, different animals to hunt, unfamiliar plants to test for edibility, weather patterns that could dictate movement, and predators with new hunting tactics. Slowly, humans learned to read the cues of each environment, embedding that knowledge into the cultural fabric of their groups. By the time Homo sapiens emerged in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago, earlier migrations had already carried human relatives far and wide. When our own species began its wider dispersal, it built on the paths blazed by these predecessors. Genetic and archaeological evidence suggests that waves of modern humans began moving into the Middle East and beyond around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, replacing or interbreeding with earlier human species along the way. This gradual spread was not uniform. Some regions remained uninhabited for tens of thousands of years, while others saw repeated cycles of occupation and abandonment as climates shifted. Yet over time, the human footprint extended into nearly every reachable environment, from tropical islands to arid plateaus, from fertile river valleys to windswept tundra. The journey was not simply a matter of covering distance. It was the slow weaving of humanity into the fabric of the planet. One migration, one settlement, one adaptation at a time. In each new place, the foundations of survival, food, water, shelter, cooperation, remained constant, but their expressions shifted to fit the local conditions. The skills learned on African savannas were reshaped to suit the icy expanses of northern Europe, the dense jungles of Southeast Asia, and the high plateaus of Central Asia. The same ingenuity that had allowed early humans to adapt to shifting African climates now allowed them to thrive in settings as different from their origins as any on Earth. And with the continent slowly filling with human life, the next great challenge awaited: the intricate and delicate relationship with the land itself, a relationship that would both sustain and threaten them as they learned to read its rhythms and endure its changes. The ability of early humans to survive in an unpredictable and often hostile world did not rest solely on their strength, endurance, or adaptability in a given moment. It relied, perhaps most profoundly, on the slow accumulation and transmission of knowledge, a form of inheritance that was not written in genes but in the habits, memories, and practices passed from one generation to the next. This was the domestication not of animals or plants, but of skills themselves, the careful cultivation of ways of living that could be learned and improved upon, and carried forward like an invisible toolkit through time. Each skill, whether simple or complex, represented countless generations of trial, error, and observation. In a world where failure to identify a poisonous root or misjudge the strength of ice could mean death, knowledge became a kind of collective memory embedded in the group's culture. These were not abstract teachings but lived, practical instructions, demonstrated through action, reinforced by necessity, and absorbed from the earliest stages of life. Children learned by watching and imitating, their eyes tracking the movements of elders as they shaped stone into blades, coaxed sparks into flame, or bent over the ground to examine faint tracks in the dust. Tracking, for example, was more than following the obvious imprint of a hoof in the mud. It was a refined practice, requiring the reading of subtle signs, the angle of a bent twig, the scatter of disturbed pebbles, the faint shift in soil color where weight had compressed it. Such observations could reveal not only the direction and speed of an animal, but also its condition, whether it was limping, carrying young, or weakened by hunger. Passed down through generations, these skills became so internalized that they could be applied almost unconsciously, much as modern people read facial expressions without thinking. The recognition of edible plants was equally critical and equally nuanced. In the absence of written records or botanical guides, survival depended on intimate familiarity with the plants of each region, knowledge that could only be gained through years of observation and testing. Some plants might be safe when cooked but toxic when raw, others might be edible only at certain stages of growth or in certain seasons. Groups moving into new territories had to adapt this inherited plant lore to unfamiliar environments, cross-referencing old knowledge with cautious experimentation. This required a careful balance between curiosity and caution, as a single mistake could be deadly. Tool-making, too, was more than the simple act of shaping stone or bone. It was a chain of skills, each link requiring precise knowledge, selecting the right type of rock, striking at the correct angle to produce sharp flakes, shaping edges for specific tasks, and repairing or resharpening worn tools. Over time, the most effective designs, a hand axe with a balanced weight, a spear point that resisted shattering, became part of the group's shared repertoire. Though the tools themselves might be lost to wear or decay, the methods for making them could persist for thousands of years through teaching and imitation. Fire making, once it could be done without relying on natural sources, became another skill bound tightly to cultural inheritance. Knowing how to find dry tinder in wet conditions, how to shield a flame from wind, how to build a fire that smoldered through the night without constant tending. These were not just conveniences, but matters of survival. Passing on such knowledge meant the difference between a group that could endure a long winter in relative comfort and one that might perish in the cold. Even movement across the landscape, migration, hunting routes, seasonal returns to familiar shelters, depended on shared memory. Landmarks became part of an oral map, each tied to practical information: the location of a spring that never dried, the grove where a certain fruit ripened at the start of summer, the mountain pass that remained snow-free longest. These mental maps were expanded and refined with each generation, allowing later groups to navigate vast territories without the benefit of written records or compasses. The domestication of these survival skills was not static. New experiences, encounters with unfamiliar environments, and the gradual refinement of techniques meant that knowledge evolved over time. A better method for binding a stone point to a wooden shaft, learned in one generation, could become standard practice in the next. A newly discovered food source might be incorporated into the group's diet, changing patterns of movement, or altering the balance between hunting and gathering. In this way, human culture, even in its most ancient forms, was dynamic, building layer upon layer of inherited skill and innovation. This cultural inheritance also served as a unifying force. Shared skills reinforced group identity, distinguishing us from them as clearly as physical appearance or language. Groups that exchanged knowledge, through alliances, intermarriage or encounters during migration, could gain new advantages, blending different traditions of tool-making, hunting, or plant use. Conversely, groups that lost critical knowledge through misfortune or isolation might struggle to adapt when faced with environmental changes. In a sense, the domestication of survival skills was humanity's first and most enduring form of wealth, an intangible resource that could be carried without burden, traded without loss, and increased through use. It allowed early humans not only to survive in familiar settings, but to step into unknown landscapes with the confidence that their inherited knowledge could be adapted to meet new challenges. And as these skills deepened and spread, they provided the foundation for the next great human achievement: the ability to live with the land, not merely as a resource to be consumed, but as a partner whose patterns could be understood, respected, and worked with over generations. The long history of early humanity was punctuated not only by the slow, grinding challenges of everyday survival, but also by moments of sudden, catastrophic change, events so extreme that they threatened the very continuity of our species. These extinction-level threats came in many forms: towering volcanic eruptions that cloaked entire continents in ash, abrupt plunges in global temperature that froze landscapes into sterile ice fields, and the insidious spread of diseases against which early humans had no defenses. Each event arrived without warning in the timescales of human life, and yet each one left marks in the archaeological and genetic record, scars of survival written into the lineage of those who endured. Volcanic eruptions were among the most violent of these threats. While most eruptions in human memory have been localized, prehistoric ones could be continent-spanning catastrophes. The Toba supereruption, which occurred roughly 74,000 years ago in what is now Indonesia, stands as one of the most dramatic examples. The eruption released an estimated 2,800 cubic kilometers of volcanic material into the atmosphere, forming vast clouds of ash that blotted out sunlight for months. The resulting volcanic winter drastically cooled the planet's climate, killing plants, collapsing food chains, and making survival in many regions all but impossible. Ashfall blanketed landscapes thousands of kilometers from the eruption site, contaminating water sources and choking the air. Archaeological evidence suggests that human populations may have been reduced to small scattered bands, with genetic studies indicating a possible population bottleneck during this period. Equally dangerous were the sudden climate shifts that occurred throughout the Pleistocene epoch. Glacial cycles could move from gradual cooling to severe freezes in just a few human generations, forcing people to abandon once fertile regions for bleak, frozen lands or to retreat into areas where resources were scarce but shelter might be found. Such changes altered migration routes, decimated game populations and shortened growing seasons for edible plants. For early humans who lacked advanced storage methods or reliable year-round food sources, these shifts could mean the difference between persistence and disappearance. The Younger Dryas, a sudden cold snap around 12,900 years ago, is thought to have caused severe disruption to both ecosystems and human societies, delaying the development of agriculture in some regions and triggering mass relocations. Disease, though harder to detect in the archaeological record, was another persistent and unpredictable threat. In small mobile groups, outbreaks of illness may have burned through populations rapidly, leaving survivors weakened and vulnerable to other dangers. Unlike in settled agricultural societies where close proximity to domesticated animals later spawned epidemics, prehistoric diseases likely came from environmental pathogens, parasites, and occasional zoonotic jumps from wild animals. A wound infected by bacteria, a contaminated water source, or a parasite introduced through undercooked meat could spread silently among kin groups, eliminating large portions of a community in a short span. With no medicine beyond herbal knowledge and rudimentary treatment methods, survival often depended on the natural resistance of individuals and the ability of the group to adapt to new hygienic practices, such as avoiding certain waterholes or shifting camps to fresher terrain. The resilience required to survive such events went beyond physical endurance. It demanded flexibility in thinking, willingness to abandon familiar territories, and the capacity to improvise under unfamiliar conditions. When the climate changed, food gathering strategies had to change with it. Hunters might switch from pursuing large game to smaller, more numerous animals, while gatherers might place greater emphasis on stored nuts or roots that could be dug up in winter. When volcanic ash smothered vegetation, groups had to travel vast distances to find unspoiled foraging grounds, sometimes encountering and competing with other displaced bands along the way. Social cohesion played a vital role in resilience. In times of scarcity or displacement, the cooperation of the group was often the only buffer against total collapse. Elders' memories of past disasters, preserved through oral tradition, could guide decisions in the present. A story of a great darkness, told by firelight, might encode practical survival strategies, move toward the low valleys when the snow lingers too long, or seek the coast when the rivers run dry. These traditions were not romanticized myths in their time but functional, memory-based survival guides, giving later generations a chance to endure hazards they had never personally experienced. Genetic evidence suggests that the surviving human populations of these bottlenecks were often surprisingly small, possibly just a few thousand breeding individuals worldwide at certain points. This meant that every life saved mattered immensely to the continuation of the species. Survival was a communal project, and success depended on the pooling of knowledge, resources, and labor. Remarkably, the very skills and cultural habits that had been domesticated over countless generations, tracking, foraging, tool-making, fire use, also provided the means to withstand these rare but devastating threats. Even when much of the familiar world disappeared beneath ice or ash, early humans could draw on the adaptability these skills afforded. The same ability to improvise a tool from an unfamiliar stone, to read the tracks of a never-before-seen animal, or to test an unknown plant for edibility, allowed our ancestors to navigate worlds transformed beyond recognition. And each time humanity passed through such a crucible, the survivors carried forward not only the genetic legacy of endurance, but also new layers of cultural resilience. They emerged with broader knowledge, expanded migration routes, and sometimes new alliances formed in the face of shared hardship. The memory of danger, embedded in both story and habit, became part of the inheritance they passed to their descendants, preparing them, however imperfectly, for the next great trial the Earth might impose. The memory of past hardships, volcanic winters, frozen ages and long migrations, lingered in the habits of prehistoric humans long after the immediate dangers had passed. Generations born into more stable climates inherited not only the tools and skills of survival, but also an acute awareness of how fragile abundance could be. This mindset, born from thousands of years of uncertainty, made any slight improvement in food security profoundly significant. It was in this space between pure necessity and the first experiments in foresight that the earliest seeds, both literal and cultural, of a new way of life began to take root. For countless millennia, humans had lived in a pattern dictated by the seasons, the migration of animals, and the ripening of plants. The mobility of hunter-gatherer life was essential, yet it was also limiting. A band could only carry so much, store so much, and remain in one place for so long before the local resources were depleted. The earliest glimmers of change did not come as sudden inventions, but as gradual shifts in observation and practice. Somewhere, perhaps tens of thousands of years before agriculture as we know it, humans began to notice that certain plants appeared in the same place each year, often more abundantly if the soil had been disturbed, the weeds removed, or fallen seeds left behind. At first, these observations may have been incidental. A cluster of edible grasses might spring up near a camp where seeds had been dropped during threshing, or berry bushes might flourish near old fire pits, where the soil had been cleared of competing plants. Such occurrences, repeated over generations, would not have gone unnoticed by people whose survival depended on reading subtle signs in the landscape. While the exact locations and times of these earliest proto-agricultural practices remain speculative, archaeological evidence from sites like Ohala II in Israel, dating to around 23,000 years ago, suggests that people were already collecting, processing, and perhaps even tending wild cereals long before the official Neolithic revolution. Animal observation followed a similar trajectory. Hunters and scavengers had long studied the habits of the animals they pursued, learning seasonal patterns, mating cycles, and favored feeding grounds. Over time, this deep familiarity began to suggest possibilities beyond the kill. The presence of docile or easily herded species, young animals orphaned during a hunt, or those drawn repeatedly to human refuse piles, offered the first glimpses of a different kind of relationship between humans and other species. Full domestication of animals like sheep, goats, and cattle would not emerge until much later. The seeds of the idea that animals could be encouraged to remain near humans for mutual benefit were already in the soil of human imagination. The beginnings of longer-term settlement were not yet the fixed villages of later agricultural societies, but rather seasonal or semi-permanent camps in resource-rich areas. Such places might be along a riverbank that yielded fish and fresh water year-round, or on a plateau that overlooked multiple hunting grounds. The key difference was time. Staying in one place longer allowed more sustained use of local plants, more secure storage of gathered foods, and more elaborate shelters than those practical for fully nomadic life. It also made the care of young children and the elderly easier, reinforcing social bonds and intergenerational knowledge transfer. Fire played a quiet but crucial role in this transition. Beyond cooking and warmth, fire could be used to clear undergrowth, encouraging the growth of certain edible plants, and creating open spaces that attracted grazing animals. These intentional burnings, which have been documented in various indigenous land management practices even in recent centuries, may have had prehistoric roots stretching far back into the Pleistocene. Such environmental shaping blurred the line between wild and managed landscapes, further nudging human societies toward the realization that they could influence the availability of their resources. The shift toward plant tending and animal observation was not uniform across the globe. In some regions, the abundance of wild foods meant there was little incentive to invest labor in cultivation. In others, especially where resources were more seasonal or unpredictable. The pressure to secure a reliable supply may have driven experimentation. Genetic studies of domesticated plants like wheat, barley and lentils suggest that these species underwent a slow process of selection long before they became staples of settled farming. This implies that for thousands of years, humans were unconsciously, or perhaps semi-consciously, shaping the evolution of their food sources simply by favoring certain plants and creating conditions that encouraged their growth. The implications of this change extended beyond subsistence. Staying longer in one place meant that people could accumulate more material goods, tools, containers, hides and ornaments, without the constant need to carry them. It also meant that symbolic or ritual sites could develop, tied to specific landscapes rather than to the migratory memory of the group. Burial sites, rock art and communal workspaces became markers of identity and continuity, giving physical form to a group's connection with a place. And yet, this was not a simple or inevitable path toward farming and civilization. Many groups likely experimented with plant tending and abandoned it, returning to full mobility when conditions changed or when the labor required outweighed the benefits. Early settlements could fail due to drought, disease or overuse of local resources. The resilience of human societies at this stage lay in their ability to shift between strategies, to forage, hunt, tend plants, or relocate as needed. This flexibility, tested and refined over countless generations, was the true foundation upon which agriculture would eventually be built. The world that emerged from these gradual changes was one in which humans were no longer solely at the mercy of what the land provided spontaneously. They were beginning, in small but meaningful ways, to shape that provision, to create the conditions for abundance rather than simply finding it. This was not yet the agricultural world of granaries and domesticated herds, but it was a threshold, and once crossed, the human relationship with the environment would never be the same. The pattern of life that had sustained humanity for hundreds of thousands of years was slowly giving way to something unfamiliar. Across scattered valleys, coastal plains and fertile riverbanks, the once restless bands of hunter-gatherers were finding reasons to remain in place for longer stretches of time. The knowledge passed down through generations, the careful shaping of stone, the seasonal reading of landscapes, the quiet exchange of skills between groups, was beginning to converge into a new form of human existence. What had been small, experimental steps in plant tending and animal observation were becoming more deliberate. The harvest of wild grains was followed by the planting of seeds. The shelter of brush and hide was replaced by sturdier frames of timber and mud. These changes were not yet the full force of agriculture, but they carried its shadow. The rhythm of life began to shift from the wide-ranging unpredictability of the wild to the steadier cycle of cultivation, storage and planned hunts. Where mobility had once been a constant necessity, permanence now began to exert its pull. Along rivers like the Nile, Tigris and Indus, and in countless less documented landscapes, the fertility of the soil encouraged repeated use of the same plots. The accumulation of food stores lessened the urgency of constant movement, and with it came new ways of living together. Small groups began to cluster more closely, bound not just by kinship, but by the shared maintenance of a place. These proto-villages were modest affairs, perhaps only a few extended families, their dwellings arranged in a loose circle or along a waterway, but they represented a profound shift in the human story. In such places, children might grow up knowing the same horizon line all their lives. Tools became more specialized, storage pits more common, and fire more consistently present at the heart of the community. With this stability came the beginnings of surplus, modest at first, but enough to alter social dynamics. Those skilled in tool-making might exchange their work for extra food. Those adept at tracking animals might be called upon by more than their own family group. The knowledge of one became the resource of many, and cooperation expanded beyond immediate survival. Alongside this, the idea of territory began to emerge more sharply. The land around a settlement was no longer just an area to be passed through, but a resource to be maintained, and when necessary defended. These changes also carried their own risks. Denser living arrangements meant closer proximity to waste. attracting pests and potentially spreading disease. Reliance on specific crops or stored foods made communities vulnerable to poor harvests or spoilage. Permanent structures, while offering better protection, tied people to particular places, making flight in times of danger more complicated. Yet, despite these challenges, the pull toward a settled way of life continued to grow stronger, guided by the slow accumulation of knowledge and the subtle but undeniable advantages of stability. Over time, these small clusters would become the seeds from which the first true villages would grow. The foundations of agriculture, trade and governance, all invisible to those living through these gradual changes, were quietly being laid. By the time agriculture emerged in full force, the habits, skills and social structures needed to support it were already deeply rooted. And so, the purely prehistoric era of human existence, defined by total dependence on the shifting generosity of the land, began to recede. In its place was something new, a relationship with the environment in which humans were no longer only participants in the natural cycle, but also shapers of it. The change was slow, almost imperceptible to those who lived it, but from this quiet turning point would rise the first villages, the first complex societies, and eventually, the civilizations whose remnants still stand today. And there, in that long, almost imperceptible transition, the human story crossed an invisible threshold. The people of this age did not know they were leaving prehistory behind. To them, the clearing of a patch of land, the storing of grain in a pit, or the decision to return to the same riverside camp each year was simply life. Yet those acts were the first stones in a foundation that would carry forward into every farm, every city, every written word. The survival skills honed over countless generations, the fire in the dark, the shaping of stone, the mapping of seasons, had not been left behind. They had become the quiet architecture upon which the modern world would one day rest. The purely wild chapter of human history had closed, but its echoes would always remain, whispering beneath the noise of all that came after.